Well, let's get to this week's topics for the lecture. We're going to talk about the internal organization and value, competitive advantage, core competencies, the criteria for competitive advantage and value chain analysis, and the internal organization assessment and strategic decisions. Let's talk a little bit about innovation in action at Apple. Apple is a great example of the strength of the internal organization in defining how it will influence strategy regardless of the external environment. And by the way, this will be to some degree a great example for us to think about when we get into the Blue Ocean strategy concepts that we'll be discussing in a few weeks. But since the book uses Apple's strategic advantages as an example, I figured we'd start here using it in the framework of the analysis outlined in the book. And I'm actually hoping that we can use Apple, since coincidentally the Apple is back in the headlines in the last week or two, use Apple for our discussion topic this week. Let's look at Apple in 2008. They had record sales in the midst of a global recession, and much of it was attributed to the innovation across all their product lines. They had creative laptops. Certainly they had the iPhone, and in 2007 and 2008 people were standing in line to get their iPhone, and then the iPod with the iPod Touch had become sort of the phone and the iPod had become ubiquitous in terms of their presence in the marketplace. Their marketing capabilities were the result of very effective advertising, point-of-sale promotion, particularly in the Apple stores, where there was this extraordinary service model. Just as recently as yesterday, I was in an Apple store. So this is Sunday the 29th. I was in an Apple store on Saturday the 28th and watched as an individual who had gotten his iPad with airline points, so he didn't purchase it in the store, he gotten it for free, was given a full walk through the product by a customer service staff member at the store. So that level of extraordinary service model combined with an advertising campaign, and probably the most important thing was the cool factor. For whatever reason, Apple sort of set itself as the cool product to own, and the result is that people, regardless of whether it had every feature they needed, whether there was a camera or wasn't a camera, whether you could run Flash or you couldn't run Flash, a variety of technical limitations. There were also a lot of technical strengths, but the technical limitations could be overcome because the product itself was perceived as cool and a must-have product. Today, as a result of the strategies that Apple implemented, it's the second most valuable company in America in terms of market cap and in terms of valuation. And so from that perspective, Apple has really achieved the sort of ultimate level of success that one would hope to achieve in any space. And in the technology space, Apple is sort of the preeminent company. Of course, they have some potential negatives they're wrestling with. First and foremost is Steve Jobs. In 2010, he had a liver transplant and took a leave of absence for several months. And now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, as of January 17th, he's announced he's taking an additional permanent leave. Top management has been lured away by some other firms, so there's a hunt for talent. And there's been an evolution of tablet computing. So even though the iPad is, for the last year or so, when it was introduced at the early part of last year, has been the dominant tablet computing tool in the world, there remains the question of will the iPad remain dominant, as there are other alternative products available now in the marketplace. So that becomes those become some of the key questions that you need to consider as you think about Apple. So the external factors influencing the internal strengths, competencies, and capabilities of Apple. With the coincidence of our both being on a chapter where we're going to be talking about Apple anyway, and the announcement by Steve Jobs regarding his health, I thought it would be appropriate for us to spend a little time this week focused on Apple. And so our B-Strap 450 Network discussion forum is about Steve Jobs' health. Please go to B-Strap 450 Network. Watch the videos. In this instance, they're in the form of links to YouTube as opposed to having sort of a direct viewing capability within B-Strap 450 because both of the videos are commercial. One is from CBS News, one is from Bloomberg Television. Watch those videos and then respond in the forum to the questions that I've posed. So this week the discussion is going to focus on the impact of Steve Jobs' departure, what appears to be potentially a permanent leave, the impact of that on the future of Apple. Can it remain as strategically strong as it has? Is Steve Jobs the primary competitive advantage, or is it organizational in nature? Think about the questions I've posed, and hopefully this will be a pretty interesting discussion. So let's go over what our next topic will be. It's the internal organization and value. Value is the measure by which our product's performance characteristics and its attributes for which its customers are willing to pay. Basically, how much is a customer willing to pay for a product because of what it is? And as you look at an internal organization, as it develops a product, the question is how much of the internal organization contributes to that value. We're going to talk a little bit about the context for evaluating this internal value creation. First and foremost, as a general rule, in order to have a strong value creation capability, an organization must have a global mindset as it looks at its internal environment. It's the ability to study an internal organization in ways that don't depend on the assumptions of a single country, culture, or context. As the international market has become more and more pervasive in just about every line of business, you need to think about your product and the value it can create, not just in the context of today's customers in a particular market, but the ability of that product to create value for customers in other markets within your country, within other countries, or on a cross border basis. You need to be able to look at and analyze a firm's portfolio of resources and bundle its resources and capabilities in a way that you can actually leverage value. So it's understanding and identifying and developing and deploying resources, capabilities, and core competencies in a package that will ultimately achieve the most value possible for you by creating the best value for a customer so that you have a strategic competitive advantage. An organization's core competencies creates and sustain its competitive advantages. So it's those intrinsic capabilities of an organization, its capacity to do certain things, its capacity to build product, its capacity to manage expenses, its capacity to understand the customer. Those are examples of core competencies which, if leveraged effectively and put together in the right way, in much the same way that you put Lego pieces together to build a model, put together in the right way, you should be able to build an organization capable of generating more value than your competitors. So how do you create value? You develop the core competencies that lead to competitive advantage. So there's really no reason to be in business if you can't do certain things better than everybody else. Because to the extent that you do things in the same way or at only a marginal level in comparison to others, you cannot create value as measured by, as I said earlier, your product's performance characteristics and the attributes for which your customers are willing to pay. In other words, if you don't know what that special sauce is, if you're not capable of doing what, for example, Apple has been able to do in identifying that cool factor, identifying what it is that customers most strive for, it's an experience, it's physical appearance of the product, it's an understanding of what the customer service model needs to look like, it's an understanding of what it is that customers, the average customer expects to be able to carry in his hands or her hands to impress others. Knowing what that is and then understanding within your organization how to create that, to create it at the least cost with the most value potentially created for your customers so that they're willing to pay more for it, is the way that you measure value. Now, there are challenges in doing this. You need to be able to really think through analyzing your internal organization and making strategic decisions. Strategic decisions are non-routine decisions which have ethical implications and which influence the organization's above average returns. So it's knowing specifically what steps need to be taken at the organizational level in terms of identifying, developing, and deploying a firm's resources, capabilities, and core competencies, and understanding how to put those pieces together. As I said, it's like putting the Lego model together so that you can ensure that you are able to build something that differentiates you, whether that's a product, whether that's a service, whether it's a mindset that the customer associates with your organization that will differentiate you so the customer is willing to pay more. Now, the problem is that as managers, we face a tremendous amount of uncertainty on a variety of fronts. There are proprietary technologies that are constantly being created by competitors. There's proprietary technology that we have that may not remain proprietary. So protecting that can be the differentiating factors. There's changes in economic and political trends and societal values and shifts in customer demands. As much as the iPod and iPad seem like they are at the crux of what the consumer wants, just a few years ago there were other products that were in the same place. It's hard to believe today, but the Palm in the early part of this decade, early part of the 2000s, was the device of choice for everybody. The Palm platform and the Palm product is virtually non-existent in terms of a market influencing force, has been an extraordinary decline, and only now that HP has purchased that platform, there's even the remote possibility that it might come back to life. Yet in 2000 and 2001, Palm was the equivalent of the Apple product of today. So it is always possible that customers' expectations will change, values will change, demand will change. And then as the environment becomes increasingly complex, it's hard for managers to stay apprised of all of the external factors that may influence what drives those factors that drive the success and the internal competencies of their organization. And then the last thing that can affect an internal organization is intra-organizational conflict. Bottom line is organizations are political by design because people populate them. The word political, which sometimes is viewed as pejorative to describe negative behavior, is just the reality of life. Human beings are political animals, and therefore there is internal competition within an organization. And to the extent that there's decisions about core competencies and which of them to nurture and which should get the resources, capital, people, new technology, other resources and support, will result in battles. And as people fight for their own survival within organizations, decisions sometimes can be made that are not driven by what's best in terms of creating the most value for the end customer and therefore strategic competitive advantage, but in terms of what will meet the needs of individuals within an organization. And to the extent that conflict does exist, it becomes harder to analyze and support the internal organization's competitive advantages.